Let me tell you something strange about the child who is hated. We live in a world where childhood is supposed to be safe, warm, protected, a place where love is assumed before it is ever proven. Yet some children grow up feeling like a problem before they ever understand who they are. And here's the question that always lingers quietly beneath the surface. What happens to a person who learns early that love is conditional, unpredictable, or absent altogether? It's easy to explain it away. People say every family has conflict, every parent makes mistakes, every child exaggerates their pain. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play, one that doesn't begin with cruelty, but with absence, with misattunement, with a child slowly realizing that their presence does not bring warmth into the room. See, for the hated child, rejection doesn't always look like yelling or violence. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It's the lack of eye contact, the way affection feels rationed, the way approval is given only when you perform correctly. You learn early how to read moods, how to become smaller, how to stay useful, not because you're manipulative, but because safety requires awareness. You might notice it in everyday moments. You become hyper-responsible, hyper-aware. You sense emotional shifts before words are spoken. You anticipate disappointment before it arrives. Others see you as mature for your age, calm, easy. But inside, something else is forming, a question you don't yet have language for. Why am I tolerated but not cherished? Psychologists have found something fascinating here. Children who feel emotionally rejected often adapt by becoming observers of their environment rather than participants in it. You learn to study people instead of leaning into them. You become skilled at prediction because unpredictability once felt dangerous. Over time, this adaptation begins to look like intelligence, like emotional insight, like strength. But here's the reframe. It's not about being gifted. It's about having to grow up too early. For many hated children, the past isn't marked by one defining trauma. There isn't always a single moment you can point to. Instead, it's death by 1,000 omissions, no one asking how your day felt, no one noticing when you went quiet, no one stepping in when you learned to self-soothe long before you were ready. So you learn to regulate yourself. You learn to survive without repair. And the nervous system remembers that. At first, this self-containment feels empowering. You don't need much. You don't ask for help. You don't burden people. You pride yourself on independence, on emotional control, on being the one who doesn't fall apart. But containment without connection slowly turns into isolation. Emotions don't disappear when they're unwelcomed. They wait. They settle into the body. They become beliefs. Here's what's often misunderstood. People assume the hated child grows up angry, rebellious, or cold. But many grow up compliant, thoughtful, self-critical. They internalize rejection instead of projecting it. They don't think, "You failed me." They think, "Something must be wrong with me." There's a deeper psychological concept beneath this, attachment disruption. When love feels inconsistent or unsafe, the mind adapts by lowering expectations. You stop reaching for comfort because reaching once led to disappointment. You stop expressing need because need felt inconvenient. Over time, you learn to associate closeness with risk. Because let's be honest, most of what we call love is conditional. Be polite, be successful, be grateful, be quiet. And children absorb these rules without context. In a culture that rarely teaches emotional literacy, the hated child learns to interpret silence as truth. If no one responds, the conclusion must be you. This is where the internal world begins to split. On the surface, you function, you achieve, you help others, you listen well. But internally, there's a constant negotiation. Am I too much? Am I not enough? Should I speak or stay quiet? Should I show myself or stay hidden? Think about it. When was the first time you learned to edit yourself to be accepted? When did you realize that authenticity came with consequences? And what part of you is still waiting for permission to exist without justification? Because not every hated child grows up visibly wounded. Some grow up highly competent, emotionally intelligent, deeply empathetic. They become therapists, artists, thinkers, observers of human behavior. But this insight often comes at a cost. You understand others because you were never fully understood yourself. This is where the paradox emerges. The same environment that deprived you of safety taught you perception. The same rejection that wounded you sharpened your awareness. You learned to read emotional undercurrents because ignoring them once hurt. You learned restraint because expression wasn't safe. There's an existential layer here, because to grow up feeling unwanted is to question your right to take up space. You don't just ask, "Who am I?" You ask, "Am I allowed to be?" You begin to live internally because the external world feels unreliable. You intellectualize feelings because feeling them openly once led to rejection. This is where people say they're distant, but what if distance was once protection? Over time, the balance becomes fragile. You crave connection, but fear it. You want to be seen, but don't trust the gaze. You long for intimacy, but brace for abandonment. And this tension lives quietly in the body, in hypervigilance, in anxiety, in chronic self-monitoring. Science offers a gentle validation here. Studies show that early emotional rejection alters stress responses and emotional regulation. The brain becomes alert but guarded, efficient but cautious. It adapts beautifully to threat, but struggles with ease, not because you're broken, but because you learned too well. And yet, people shaped by this experience often carry extraordinary depth. You notice subtleties others miss. You hold complexity without collapsing. You feel deeply, even if you don't always show it. Your sensitivity isn't weakness, it's unprotected strength. Sometimes that's why adulthood feels confusing. You're capable but tired, independent but lonely, resilient but disconnected. You don't feel broken, you feel unfinished, like something essential was paused mid-sentence. But here's what's rarely said. Not every hated child wants revenge. Many just want coherence. They want to understand what happened without vilifying themselves. They want to integrate the parts that were pushed aside. They want to feel whole without pretending the past didn't matter. Maybe that's what healing really is here. Not rewriting history, not forcing forgiveness, but gently allowing yourself to name what was missing. To acknowledge that love withheld still leaves an imprint, that survival strategies deserve respect, not shame. So when you notice someone who keeps emotional distance, maybe pause before interpreting it as coldness. Ask what closeness once cost them. Ask what they learned about safety before they learned about love. Ask what part of them is still waiting to be chosen without conditions. If this feels familiar, you don't need to fix yourself. You don't need to perform healing. You don't need to justify your sensitivity or your caution. Awareness doesn't require urgency. Because being the hated child doesn't mean you were unlovable. Sometimes it means you were born into a system that couldn't meet you where you were. Sometimes it means your needs exceeded someone else's capacity, and that was never your fault. Maybe the most radical act now isn't becoming tougher. Maybe it's allowing yourself to receive without earning, to rest without apologizing, to exist without shrinking. In the end, the psychology of the hated child isn't about bitterness, it's about adaptation. It's about how a mind learns to survive emotional absence. And perhaps the real question isn't why some children felt unwanted. Perhaps it's how so many learned to keep loving anyway.